It's not often that a sequel comes out that I can wholeheartedly recommend to those who enjoyed the original, but Resident Evil 8 is definitely one of those rare games that manages to live up to the high expectations set by its predecessor, and even surpass them in many regards. Visually, the atmosphere is fantastic, and that goes for each and every one of the game's 5 main zones. Whether it be the dark and metallic underbelly of the factory, or the dusty halls of the old estate, there's some extremely moody lighting to set the tone, and a level of detail that's almost photorealistic. On top of that, the various world spaces do a great job at conveying certain feelings to you. For example, the main village feels cold and uneasy, whereas the inside of Castle Dimitrescu feels warm yet deceptively inviting, as if to provide you with a false sense of hope and erroneous escape from the world outside. Of course, the graphics aren't the only thing that plays into Resident Evil's haunting atmosphere. As you meander around the village, you'll almost always find yourself surrounded by ominous sounds like a howling wind or creaky floorboards beneath your feet. Even when you are alone, you constantly feel like you're being watched, or as if the next pack of enemies could be waiting for you right around the corner. And it's all thanks to those little details like a rustle in the bushes behind you, or a dark figure passing by out of the corner of your eye. As a whole, it's that mixture of sound and visuals that truly helps to keep you on edge. With that said, I do think the atmosphere in this game could have been even better. For instance, while the music is certainly well done, I honestly believe it could have been a lot scarier. It's almost as if the tone is just a little bit too light, especially during some of the game's more frightening chase sequences. I do think some people will probably appreciate this, as it is more akin to Biohazard's soundtrack. It just wasn't for me. And I would even go as far as to say that Resident Evil 7 actually had a number of tracks that were much creepier than the ones offered here. Thankfully, while the soundtrack didn't quite hit the mark for me, the new assortment of enemies offered in Village definitely did. Rather than purely fighting those black mold creatures from Biohazard, this time around you'll be facing off against monsters like giant bats, bloodthirsty lichen, and armored undead. And if that's not enough for you, there's even a few freakish mini-bosses to really get your blood pumping.
Ha! You again?
Not to mention, the animation work on these things and many of the game's main antagonists is super well done, most notably when it comes to characters like Lady Dimitrescu. As a survival horror game, it's largely thanks to these creative improvements that makes Village's enemies so much more enjoyable to fight. In fact, one of the only shortcomings the game has when it comes to those moments of hair-raising tension is the weapon's lackluster sound design. The guns just don't seem to pack enough punch. It's pretty fitting considering how little damage they do, but still, beefing those sounds up a bit could have made using them feel a little more impactful. Monsters and weapons aside, one of the best parts about Village would definitely have to be its level design. Since Resident Evil 8 operates on a much larger scale than its predecessor, not only do you get a far more impressive set of locations to explore, from half-sunken villages to towering castles, but many of these landmarks also end up making for a unique array of stunning vistas as you approach them from afar. All of this is not to say that Biohazard needed this level of variety, or grand sense of scale, especially considering its smaller, close-knit setting, but more so that Resident Evil 8 is a refreshing change-up from what came before, which can be quite nice for those who want to play these two titles back-to-back. While the game may not be for everyone, each of its 5 zones certainly has something to offer almost every type of horror fan. There are some areas that toy more with the psychological side of horror, by stripping you of your gear and making you feel like running is your only option. But then there are other areas where the game really embraces the survival horror genre, and it almost ends up feeling more like the Metro series. You may have weapons to defend yourself with, but there's still that fear in the back of your mind that you might run out of ammo before you manage to escape or take out all of the enemies. Some people are naturally going to find certain zones less scary than others, particularly when it gets a little more shooting gallery-esque, but I always find it pretty impressive when a game can give you the tools you need to survive and still keep you on the edge of your seat. I can also appreciate how, rather than relying on jump scares, much of the fear that this game instills comes from suspense. Sometimes that tension might come from an overwhelming number of enemies, and other times it might be purely psychological. The beauty of it is that there's always that uncertainty of survival, and where it comes from really just depends on what zone you're in. Now, while each area undeniably feels like its own unique branch of horror, the level designers have actually done a nice job at giving the entire game world a tremendous sense of interconnectivity. Largely, this is done using a plethora of Metroidvania elements, like secret passageways or rooms that you can only open up later on. And the game complements those aspects really well with numerous puzzles scattered throughout the entire experience. These may not be the hardest puzzles to solve or always the most creative, but I still found them to be a lot of fun. And there's definitely something to be said about the tension that comes with trying to solve a riddle when some bloodthirsty being may be standing just a few feet away from you, ready to turn you into their afternoon snack. Naturally, the downside of these Metroidvania elements is that you are going to be retreading a lot of familiar ground. But luckily, the game always manages to spice up those older areas with a change in the time of day or type of enemies that occupy a location. So at no point do you ever feel like you're slogging through the same repetitive experience. Story-wise, Village takes place 3 years after the events of Resident Evil 7, and has you searching for your daughter who's been stolen by an evil witch. While the game's writing isn't anything special, I do think the voice acting, gameplay, and level design are strong enough to keep you hooked and on the edge of your seat from start to finish. And though this is a direct sequel, you don't need to have played Biohazard to enjoy this. Overall, Village may not be for everyone, but it definitely lived up to my expectations and ultimately lands itself at an 8 out of 10 from me. If you played Resident Evil Biohazard and liked it, or enjoy other survival horror games of that nature, I genuinely believe you're going to enjoy this.